Well, thank you so much for having me. I walked across campus and saw my name in giant signs, so that is a very warm and generous welcome. I've never been to Riverside before, so it's very nice to come to your campus. I know. Well, I'm Canadian, so I haven't lived in California that long, so I at least have an excuse. So when I moved to California 4 years ago, I started to study water, because obviously water is a really big issue here. But most of my work looks at electricity. So a lot of this research project is informed from thinking about what we've learned from electricity conservation and seeing if we can say similar things about water conservation. And I owe an enormous debt to my wonderful grad student, Patrick Honeycutt, who is excellent and has worked really hard on this project. And he has spearheaded collection from urban water districts of data for about 3 years now. And as he likes to say, he also works on peacekeeping. It's easier to get data from African countries on peacekeeping missions than it is to get water from California urban water districts. So that gives you a sense of the data collection challenge on this project. And I will also say that the California Institute for Water Resources and the UC Santa Barbara Senate have given us some funds to work on this project. So you probably know, and I know some of you who actually work on these issues, that over the last few years when Governor Jerry Brown was in office, we obviously went through a terrible drought, and the governor put in place several restrictions. So basically what he said was that the urban water districts were required to meet mandatory reduction targets. Those were initially 20% in 2014, and then they went up to 25% in 2015. And they were designed in specific ways where specific urban water districts had different kinds of targets to meet, et cetera. So that is the policy that we're looking at today. And I'm sure it's not hard to remember the drought here. It's certainly not hard to remember it in Santa Barbara. Our main water source is Lake Cachuma, which is a reservoir just north of the city, and it went down to something like below 10% when the drought was really bad. And now it's back up about 75%, so we're very lucky. And that obviously has a huge difference in terms of what the lake actually looks like. So I imagine you have similar stories here. Southern California was extremely impacted by the drought, even more so than the north. And in the case of Santa Barbara County, we actually only came out of drought this year. So we were the last counties impacted, Santa Barbara and Ventura counties. So what am I going to try to do? Well, we know that climate change is already happening. If you don't know that, I will let you know. It's already happening. Climate change is here. It's not just a future problem. It's also a present-day problem. And that is changing the way rainfall patterns happen around the globe, including, of course, in California. So we know that water management is a really big, difficult thing to do, even under the best of circumstances, and particularly in a state like California, which has had massive state projects to change the way that water flows across the state for over 100 years. And the reality is that climate change is really going to be stressing not just our resources, but also our governance institutions. And that's something that I want to focus on a fair amount today. So within this context, we faced a really large drought, and we had the governor mandating basically mandatory reduction targets. These were pretty unique policy approaches. There were notable differences where, for example, agricultural water districts did not have to reduce to the same amount as urban water districts, and so there were also distributional questions. And so the question that we wanted to try to answer with this project is, well, what explains variation in urban water districts' ability to save water, to drive water conservation? And I will tell you off the bat that I don't think I have fully answered that question yet, but I will say we've tried really hard. And so I hope to try to convince you, at least by what we know so far. And it's not from a lack of effort that we don't have the answer yet. It's from a lack of data and cooperation from urban water districts. But we will continue to try to do that. So what might be some hypotheses or some theory that we might bring to bear on these kinds of questions? Well, from the environmental politics literature or even in environmental economics, we have a bunch of theories about how we should be managing resources. Okay, so Elinor Ostrom famously won the Nobel Prize in economics for her research, which showed that you can manage common pool resources, things like water, through bottom-up efforts. And do you want me to turn off on my mic? Is it not working?
No, if it could be a little louder.
Oh, sure. Do you want me to try to move this thing? Does that make it louder?
Yes.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, no problem. Thank you for letting me know. So Elinor Ostrom came up with this idea that you could have decentralized management of water resources. And she won the Nobel Prize for that work. And I don't know if people have read her work, but it actually started in part with California water management. That was one of her very first cases, if not her first case. Interestingly, the state plays a fairly important role in that case, which she tends to overlook, but it's a very interesting beginning of the story here. Others, like Axelrod and Bob Cohane, have talked about how bottom-up management of common resources can be problematic because you lack accountability. So this is sort of a different approach to it. Now, Megan Mullen, who is a scholar in environmental politics at Duke, has really interesting research looking specifically at urban water governance. And she shows that actually this bottom-up management, the Ostrom sort of approach to resource management, is really a conditional success, where basically you need to have high salience. People need to be paying attention to water, and that can also be improved by having elections. So if water boards, for example, are elected. So there have to be governance institutions that allow for these water management organizations to actually be held accountable by the public, because the public is paying attention to them and they actually have some kind of institutional mechanism like an election to hold those people accountable. So what myself and my co-author Patrick Honeycutt are currently saying in the work that we're working on is that bottom-up management of a resource through, for example, urban water districts meeting water targets is not effective if you don't have any kind of evaluation or learning. And that is certainly what's happening in California right now. You know, there's us trying to autonomously evaluate what these districts did, but they are not tracking, for example, what strategies they're using or doing any kind of evaluation like an experiment or something else to try to figure out how can we best save water. And when you compare that to the electricity sector, that's pretty abysmal, because for a long time, for decades, we've been doing experiments, we've been having utilities overseen by pretty intensive regulators, public utility commissions, and that just doesn't exist in the water space in the same way. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit more specific, a little bit less theoretically broad now, and talk about how can institutions effectively change behavior. So the first research I ever did as an undergraduate was to try to understand how could we get people to save electricity, so electricity conservation. And I'm really drawing on that work, which I did from a psychology perspective, in how we set up this project. So we know from research in psychology that things like providing people information, like here's how you can get a low flow shower head, or saving water is very important. Generally, that is not shown to be effective, okay? So we often think if we just provide people information, like you should vaccinate your children, for example, which you should do, that will somehow drive behavior. And the results are pretty much no. It's not just about information. Of course, economics is a whole discipline obsessed with price, and so there's different views on how price can affect behavior. On the one hand, of course, pricing can be a really strong signal for people to conserve, but there's actually fairly interesting research from psychology which shows that it can undermine intrinsic motivations. So if you pay somebody, for example, to play the piano, and then you stop paying them, then they may stop playing the piano, because rather than playing the piano because it's something that they love to do for the art of it or something like that, it becomes something that they love to do because they're paid for it. So we know that paying people can undermine intrinsic motivation. And finally, there's a fair amount of research that I've done in electricity conservation and that others have done more seminally in the early days of social psychology research on behavior change, which showed that social norms can actually be an extremely powerful way to change behavior. And in political science, we've seen this more recently in interesting research looking at how social norms can, for example, get people to vote. So social norms seem to be something that are pretty powerful. And I'm going to show you today that we do find that social norms seem to play an important role in the water conservation context as well. Okay, so what does the data look like? So where are these urban water districts? Well, you can see on the left that basically they're everywhere in the state. There's a few counties where we don't have any urban water districts, mostly inland and more agricultural or rural areas, but pretty much everywhere else we have some urban water districts. And the map on the right is the best shapefile that's available, because here's another note about data availability. There is no publicly available high-quality shapefile on urban water districts, interesting fact. So you can see here that that we have variation in where they are and how bad the drought was. And those colors may not show up too well, but you probably already know that the drought was particularly bad in Southern California. So how did these districts do during the time period that Governor Brown imposed these mandatory conservation targets? Well, you can see that, so you probably can't tell, but right here is Santa Barbara, and we're in green, so we did really good, crushed it. Up here in the north, we have a couple other districts, but actually a lot of places underperformed their targets. So a lot of places were not meeting their overall targets, and a few, particularly in the Bay Area down here, these are all green, were meeting or exceeding their targets. Okay, so what are we going to do to try to answer the question of, did specific strategies lead to water conservation? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to compile a data set. Yes?
When you talk about targets, are you saying that both the voluntary 20% or the mandatory 25%?
So the time period stretches from 2014, which includes the voluntary 20%, and then also includes the tier targets based on the 25%. So yes, it applies a standard 20% during the voluntary time period, and then during the mandatory time period from April 2015 onwards, it applies the tier target that was applied to that specific urban water district. Yeah. So yeah, we kind of take the voluntary as somewhat mandatory just for the sake of our analysis. Okay, so it's a 22-month panel data set. So what is a panel data set? It's basically we're going to look at each district over time. Okay, so we're going to say, what did this district do in April 2015? What did it do in May 2015? What did it do in June? And so on and so forth. Getting this data is proving very difficult, as you can imagine. The State Water Resources Control Board provides what we would call our dependent variable, which is how much water were all of these urban water districts using. So we use that as the basis for the data set. Although I will say there's quality issues with this data too, and that depending on the download that you take, it changes a lot. So clearly urban water districts are not reporting in a standardized way their information to the State Water Resources Control Board, making evaluation more difficult. And then what we do is we basically build independent variables. So we think about, well, what things might explain the patterns that we see in terms of water conservation. Those are things like, well, how much does it cost to buy water in any given month? Are we using some kind of social norms treatment in any kind of month? Do we provide rebates, et cetera? And so for each district, we're collecting data on what they're doing in every single month. We also, of course, want to know, was it raining in that month and how bad was the drought? Because that's just going to add a lot of noise to our data set otherwise. You know that if it rains, you can turn off your outdoor irrigation, you don't water things as much, et cetera. So we need to be able to control for those kinds of factors as well. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to run a pretty standard model from econometrics, which is just called a fixed effects model. What that's going to allow us to do is basically to compare within a given district over time, how can we explain what is happening to that district after controlling for basically the average behavior of that district and the time period, right? So we're going to include both unit-specific fixed effects, aka how does this district act on average over time, as well as time period fixed effects. So in the month of May, did we all save a lot of water? In the month of June, did we all use a lot of water, etc.? Okay, so the first thing I'm going to just show you is our descriptive data. So we have spent about 3 years trying to gather this data. I have had like maybe 10 undergraduates on this project, calling urban water districts, several grad students. It's been a beast. But here's what we have found out from about, let's say 30% of districts that we've managed to get to answer our questions. The best performing districts are doing things fairly similarly to the worst performing districts, okay? So this is the top 25% performers, and this is the bottom 25%. And what you can see is they're both providing information, so that's unlikely to explain variation in how they did, right? They're both providing information both on the drought and in general how to save water. Where we see some variation in terms of the strategies that the best and worst performers are using is, well, the best performers are running rebate programs a fair amount more than the worst performers. They also seem to have a different pricing structure than the worst performers. What do I mean by that? There are still districts in the state that just have a flat cost for, not for your entire water bill, but for every time you use a unit of water, you pay the same price. And in electricity and in most urban water districts, we have what's called tiered pricing, which makes sense. You know, there's a certain amount of water that you get for cheap to do basic things, and then as you use more and more water, we charge you more and more money. Well, there are still districts in this state, despite the really terrible situation we're in, that don't do that yet. And you can see that more of them are in the worst performing districts than in the best performing districts. There are other things that we know that work from electricity, such as providing personal feedback. So, you know, here's how much water you used this May, and here's how much you used last May, or here's how much you used last month. Do you guys read your water bills? Because they do stuff like this. I mean, Santa Barbara does it all, so I get to see the whole range of things, but maybe your district does different kinds of things. Sometimes they provide penalties. You can see that actually the worst performing districts are penalizing their people more, which kind of makes sense. They're overusing water, and so they're using penalties more. What is particularly interesting is that what we're calling social penalties, or you could just think of social norms. I'm going to show you what that is in a little bit, but basically it's a signal to people like, hey, you're using too much water. You can see that a lot more of that is happening in the best performing districts than the worst. And finally, neighbor comparison. This is an idea that was developed a fair amount in electricity, where you say, here's how much water you're using, here's how much your neighbor is using. Does a water district in Riverside do this kind of thing? Do you guys know? Yeah? We do this in Santa Barbara too. It's actually not that common though.
The best performance was when I was away for 2 months.
Yes, then you were beating all your neighbors, right? You leave for 2 months and you're killing it. But that is actually not very widely used in water, and it seems like it might be something that works. Okay. Yes.
Just a quick clarification.
Yes.
How many utilities you have in your data set?
Yes.
What's the second one? Is this data for the strategies over time, or is just a one shot that you
What I'm showing you right now is a one-shot. The panel data set is over time, of course. So I'm just giving you descriptive results overall, just so you can have sort of a sense in your mind of what the data looks like. In terms of the data set, there's 410 urban water districts in the state, and as I mentioned, we've only gotten about 30% of them to provide us with comprehensive data. So we have a sample size, depending on the variable, of around 100, maybe up to 150. And I'm going to show you that in a future image. Okay, the other thing we really wanted to know, which shockingly is not available to us as citizens of this state, is how much do people pay for water? I will assure you that if you would like to know how much people pay for electricity, it is highly regulated by the Public Utility Commission, and you can go read all the debates about how much you're going to pay and download all that data. You cannot do that for water. You have to collect that data, and it's extremely difficult to get. But we have had some very intrepid undergraduates looking up city council meeting minutes and calling districts and doing everything else. And here's what we have found so far. So what we did was we just decided that 15 CCF would be something like an average bill that a 4-person family might use if they, for example, had some landscaping and watered outside to some extent. Okay, so that's kind of what we're taking as an average bill. It could be a bit smaller, like 12 or 10, but that was the number that we picked as a benchmark because others have done that in literature. And what you can see here is the variation in the top quartile, the top 25%, and the bottom 25%. And again, this is just average bill pricing, so the data is over time, but I'm just showing you as sort of a snapshot of the mean. And you can see right off the bat that, wow, the best performers are charging about twice what the worst performers are doing. I think that's very interesting, irrespective of this effectiveness question, from an equality perspective across the state, that there's massive differences in what people are paying for water across the state, and that's not even known to people because this data is not even collected or made publicly available. If you just wanted to look at for one unit, kind of like what we would call a kilowatt hour in electricity, or a CCF in which is 1,000 cubic feet of water, here's what the average prices are. So again, you can see that for one unit, you're paying about 3 times more in the best performing districts than in the worst performing districts. And I'll just say that this, by the way, the top is what we kind of calculated as a full bill. So we included service charges and everything else. We tried to construct, if I bought 15 CCF in this month, in this district, what would I pay? Okay. So now I'm going to show you the fixed effects models for all my friends who are into that in the room. And here they are. So What we have to do, which is not ideal, is we have to run each model with one independent variable because we have missingness on other variables across the data set. So for each row, you can think of that as a given model. And what we're doing is we're controlling for rainfall and for drought severity, but not for the other kinds of interventions happening simultaneously because the model won't run unless we do imputation, which causes other kinds of problems. Okay, so first thing for my economists in the room, fascinating result here, and I'll tell you, no matter how much more data we add, it just seems to stay there. It does not seem that increasing the cost of water is driving water conservation in California. We have a negative point estimate here, so that would be the sign that you would expect, but the standard error, as you can see, is very big, and therefore the p-value is very far from significant. Now, what would that be from a substantive interpretation perspective? Well, this is in percentage points towards a tier target. So it means that if I wanted to get you to save 1 percentage point, to get 1 percentage point closer to meeting the target that Governor Brown had, I would have to raise your bill by $12.50, which is a lot, right? So at least in this data set during this time period, it doesn't appear to be the case that raising water prices is driving conservation. Economists all get very upset by this finding, but it does appear to be the case from the data that that is the case. Okay, so what does seem to work here? And this finding has stayed around pretty solidly as we collect more and more data. Social norms penalties, I'm going to show you what I mean by that, seems to be associated with getting 5 percentage points closer to the tier target. So that's the tier target of 20 percentage points in 2014 or 25%. So in other words, it could explain getting something like 25% or 20% closer to the tier target. Okay, so it could be doing a fair amount of the work. I'm not overly convinced by this finding because, of course, with fixed effects models, they're identifying off of the units that are changing from not having social penalties to having social penalties. And we don't have an enormous amount of those in the data set. We have about 10 cases of switchers, okay? Now the sample size is 100, so we have many cases where they're always using social penalties or never using social penalties. So it's not terrible, but I wouldn't say it's a slam dunk. I'm going to show you some more data, however, that is kind of in line with this social norm thing being part of what's doing the work here. Yes?
Can you clarify again what do you mean by social penalty?
Yes.
Yes, before you mentioned.
Yes, I'm going to show you some images what they are. Yeah, I'm going to get into them. Don't you worry, it's coming. Okay, good. So here are the fixed effects results in general, right? So some districts raised their water prices by a lot over this time period, like 30%, okay? That's a big amount over a 2-year time period to be raising people's water bills. And I don't know if people experience this. I'm a big gardener, so I have like 15 fruit trees. They take water, you may know, especially when they're young. And so I have certainly noticed my water bill go up. And I'm going to show you from survey data that we've done that Californians in general have noticed their water bills gone up because their water bills have gone up a lot in the last few years. Yet, we do not find a relationship between those rising prices and conservation. So this could suggest a few things. It could suggest that water consumption is price inelastic, that we're not somehow responding to price changes, maybe at this level where people are paying like something like $80 a month for water. Maybe it needs to get a lot higher for people to really notice it. Or that water conservation simply preceded price increases, and that's certainly what the data looks like. So here's the data. This is again just showing you by quartiles so that you can get a sense of how to think about the data. So this is the top 25%, the mean price for water over time, and what you can see here is that at the beginning of the time period, the best performing districts were already charging about twice what the worst performing districts were charging. So all of these pricing, in some sense, are baked in at the beginning of the study, which can explain why it's not really driving that result. And what you can see here is that, yes, we have these price changes. But if we plot conservation on the same figure, what does it look like? Okay, well, all of the reductions are happening here, and then here, right? And you could see here that it actually seems to precede where the price increases are happening. So that's why the model is not really telling us that price is what is driving conservation. Okay. Now, to social norms, What do I mean by this? So some districts did something relatively creative, and I have presented this in the United States and in Europe, and I pretty much get a universal when I show you what they were up to. So we'll see if you agree or not. So some districts created social penalties, okay? What do I mean by that? Well, what they did was that they posted on the doors of people, and in some cases their neighbors, when they were using too much water. So they put door hangers on doors, they put signs on garages. Yeah, see, I'm getting a nice reaction from you over here, right? Kind of shocking. And I gotta tell you, when we started this project, I didn't know that people were doing this. I had an undergraduate on the project, and her mother worked for an urban water district. And she was at home visiting her mom, and her mom said, oh, well, you know, we do this thing. And we said, no, we didn't know you did that thing. So then we started to collect that data on a bunch of urban water districts doing this, and about a third of them are. And what we show, as I've already shown you, is that it seems like, at least from the model that we have right now, that implementing these programs leads to a fairly large reduction in water use. I'll just give you a sense of what these things look like now. So here's some hangers. This one is from Santa Barbara. This one's from Carlsbad. They're things you can fill out, basically. So you check what somebody's done wrong, and you write some names and dates on it, and then you hang it on their door. It's actually a pretty intense treatment. Like when we think about, at least from political science or public policy, like this is a pretty shaming treatment, right? Wow. So we did a little bit of survey work around how do people feel about these things, and I'm going to show you that actually people are pretty okay with them, which is interesting. So it seems like an intense treatment, but maybe because water is a collective issue and people feel that it's very salient and they want to contribute to it, somehow shaming seems to be okay in this space. Okay. So hopefully that helps answer your question about what I mean by social penalties. So what this has suggested to me so far is that urban water districts were probably not the main drivers of conservation, that it was probably individuals. So everyday people doing things autonomously from their districts. Maybe this is going back to Ostrom in some ways, right? A bottom-up kind of approach to common pool resource management. Those maybe were the reasons why we save so much water. So what do California residents know about water conservation? When we started to basically study the individual level rather than looking at the district level as we got further into this project. So we did a poll in the fall of 2,000 Californians, which is a pretty big poll of a single state, and we just asked them a bunch of stuff about water. And I'm going to show you what we've asked them and what we found out. Okay, so here's where the people live. As you can see, it covers pretty much the same area that I already showed you for the urban water districts, and we asked them what water district they were part of, and you can see that it covers the state pretty well. So we got nice variation in terms of where people are living. Okay, so what did we ask them about? We asked them about their knowledge. So maybe pricing isn't driving behavior changes because people don't even notice that their bills are going up, right? They're on auto pay, they get emails, they don't even look at the bill. So let's see if people actually know how much they're paying for water, all right? That was like something we wanted to figure out. What about drought severity? Do people actually know how bad the drought is or not? Usually in political science research, we find that people don't know a lot of things. And what's interesting is that people really know how bad the drought is. So there was obviously a really effective public relations campaign that was run at all levels, and there's certainly research out of Stanford that supports that view. We also looked at just opinions. So do people support water costs rising, given we've seen massive 30% increases in bills? If that was electricity, we'd probably have a revolution in the street. I mean, carbon pricing, for example, is about putting a little bit of extra cost on oil, like at the gasoline pump, or a little bit on your electricity bills. And we see people protesting in France, or right now there's huge debates happening in Ontario, Canada over this. So are people willing to take on these additional costs for water? And I'm going to show you that unlike electricity, yeah, people seem to be willing to pay for water. Pretty interesting. And also, what are their feelings around social penalties? So I think what at least my thinking on this project has become is that water conservation seems to be a very social process, that it seems to be very visible and public in a way that other sorts of things like electricity conservation are just not. And maybe that's because we have lawns, those things are somewhat in the public space, people can see us watering outside. I don't know if you guys go on Nextdoor, but this is a neighborhood-based sort of thing. During the drought, I was not next door, and somebody was talking about how they were watering, and some neighbor came by and shamed them for watering. So these kinds of exchanges seem to be happening more in the public sphere, versus if I'm sitting in my house using a lot of electricity, leaving the lights on, that's not as public to other people. So there seems to be something social and public about water. Okay. So, do people know how much they pay for electricity? I think the answer is yes, which is interesting. So, what we asked is, how much do you think you were paying for electricity back in July 2015? And they said on average $64. And how much do you think you're paying in June 2018? And they estimated about $74. So they estimated a $10 bill increase. Now, we can do more with this data in terms of unpacking, like where people live and what their actual average bill would look like. We haven't done that yet. But in general, as a first cut, I think this does suggest that people have some knowledge that their bills are going up and that they do pay attention to their water bills. Now, what about drought severity? We similarly asked how bad was the drought in 2015? That's shown in these red bars. And you can see here that a lot more people, these are the drought monitor scores that are used to sort of make a measure of how bad the drought is. A lot of people, certainly in my county, were in 4. Others in the north were in different levels further down. But you can see here that a lot of people thought the drought was worse back in 2015, and that a lot of them thought it was better back now in 2018. So overall, people seem to be paying attention to this thing. This is certainly better than if we ask people like, who's the speaker in the Senate or something like that. They don't necessarily know who's in charge. So similarly, this is another way of visualizing the data about how people are moving. So this is 2015 and this is 2018. You can see that a lot of people thought that we went from a really bad drought to lower levels of drought. So generally the pattern is downward, suggesting that people are overall not ignorant of what's going on. Okay. This is interesting in terms of this social construction and how basically in the best performing districts, water use was probably more socialized and people were paying more attention to what other people were doing. In the best performing districts, shown in blue, you can see that fewer people are underestimating how bad the drought is, and more of them are overestimating how bad the drought is. And similarly, in the worst districts, more people are underestimating how bad the drought is, and fewer are overestimating. So again, this just falls in line with the sense that in the best performing districts, they were somehow creating a sense amongst their population that things were really bad and that we all had to do something about it. And in the worst performing districts, they didn't do as effective of a job to communicate the severity of the drought. Okay, so what about support for water bill cost increases? This is on the heels of something like a 30% increase. What I think is so surprising and encouraging, and I'm sorry this is pretty hard to read. So this is decrease on the left-hand side and increase on the right-hand side. And what you can see is that a fair amount of people just want it to stay the same. That's generally what we all think about life, status quo bias. But look, it's not as if that the data is all skewed here, right? Where everybody wants their prices to go down, having gone through massive bill increases over the last couple of years. So I think this is actually pretty encouraging that people are accepting the water bill increases. What about social penalties? Are people okay with using these fairly intense treatments of hanging hangers on doors and sort of socially sanctioning people? So we asked people, does your district use social penalties? And a bunch of people thought they did. A lot of people, of course, didn't know, which would make sense because unless you've had a hanger on your door or somebody you know has, or you've put a hanger on somebody's door, you may not know that your district is doing this thing. But look, a fair amount of them believe that they do use social penalties. And then, have you received one? Well, even in our data set, we got about 200 respondents, 10% of the sample size, that said, yeah, I've received some kind of social penalty. They may have been interpreting that more like the story I said with next door, with somebody coming and yelling at them or something like that. But overall, people are feeling like, 10% of the people are feeling like water is somehow socialized, that there is a social penalty for using too much water. We asked people, do you think your district should start using this kind of approach? We described what it is, and despite the surprisingness whenever I present this work, a lot of people say that they should, right? I mean, it's certainly not like a slam dunk, like 100% of people are saying this, but it's not the way you might expect, where everybody's saying, like, how dare you socially sanction people for their autonomous freedom life choices with their water, right? We are in America after all. And then in terms of how we think it should be used, for those of who said, yes, let's use social penalties, you can see, unlike the pricing data, a lot of people want them to be used a lot more frequently. So at least there's some support amongst some people to be using these things a lot more. Now, what about the 10% of our sample that said they had received a social penalty? How did they feel about it? Did they feel this was horrible and that it would be a terrible policy to use? Well, actually, they are pretty okay with it. So you can see that they think maybe this is more like hazing, where like if you were wrong done, then you should just pass it on to the next person. I don't know. But you can see that there's a lot more support for continuing to use it. It's not like these people are all saying, no, don't use social penalties. So I think that this data suggests that this pathway forward, if more urban water districts were to adopt this kind of approach, they wouldn't be seeing a massive backlash from their customer base or something like that. Now, similarly, in terms of this social norm story, we looked at how often people tell us that they talk about water with other people. And you can see here that, again, in the best performing districts, there's fewer people saying they never talk about water and more people saying that they talk about it at least once a year. This is with your neighbors, okay? So it seems like, again, in the best performing districts, at the margins, there's more of this social, oh, it's okay to talk about water, we all talk about water, et cetera, than in the worst performing districts. So what drives water conservation? I believe in causal inference and actually answering questions, so I don't want to tell you that I have magically answered this question. There's huge challenges with doing this work. It's certainly been hard. So I don't have a Sherlock Holmes, so-and-so did it in the bathroom with a candlestick or something like that answer for you here. But I will say that I feel increasingly convinced from this evidence that social norms do appear to matter in the water space. I will say that this really lines up with a really interesting report that came out, or I should say academic paper, that came out in Science Advances in 2017 by these Stanford researchers, which showed that media coverage happening even before the governor put those mandated targets in place really helped drive residential water conservation. So again, this speaks to sort of this public socialized communication being really important to driving conservation, as opposed to what an urban water district is doing sort of by itself to increase prices or run rebate programs or do other things that we might think matter. So I overall think that our work is in line with what these authors are saying, that social perceptions and media being an important way to build social perception seems to be important. I'll just conclude that I think this issue, even though it's a new space for me working in, is really important. That water conservation is only going to grow, especially in California. I don't know if you know this, but climate models suggest that Mediterranean regions, we live in a Mediterranean region, are projected to become deserts by something like 2050. A lot of people pretend as if the status quo that we live in today will somehow continue if we don't deal with climate change, and that's just not true. So water conservation is going to be a growing issue. And I think this puts a lot of stress on the way that we manage water in this state, and that the decentralized water governance structure of these sort of autonomous urban water districts who provide very little accountability or even information to researchers or the public is really problematic. I think that we need better resources in terms of data collection, monitoring and evaluation, things like running studies with urban water districts to see what would actually work to get people to save more water. That is really important. And it's possible that a big barrier to that, this is certainly what Megan Mullen's work shows, is that these urban water districts are under-resourced. So we may need to be supporting these urban water districts so that they're actually able to do things more effectively and save water for all of us. But overall, I think there's a need for a much greater coordination so that we can be answering these questions. And I'll leave you with one hopeful finding, which is that we asked people on our survey, how much has the drought affected you? I don't know if you find this hopeful or not, but I'll spin it as hopeful. You can see here that only maybe 10% of our survey said that it was a significant impact on their lives. You can see that another quarter said that it had a moderate impact, but a lot of people said it had some or no impact on their lives. And I think that's encouraging in terms of our ability to adapt to climate change and change the way we use water, change the way we landscape our environment, et cetera, so that we can continue to live in California even as we have more and more scarce water resources. So thank you so much for your time and attention and for having me here today, and I'm happy to take questions for the next 15 minutes. Yes?
You mentioned electricity several times, and I know that there's a huge amount of the electricity that's generated is simply used to push water around the state. Do you happen to know the percentage of the state total?
I do not. I mean, we call that the...
My feeling
Yes.
is something like 30% or something.
I don't know if it's 30%. That does seem high to me, but do you know the answer to this question? Is it 20%? Yeah, so we have built a huge backbone in this state of massive infrastructure to move water, particularly from the north to the south, and that takes a lot of energy. Putting greater conservation targets on cities and perhaps on farmers, not something I've talked about today, may save energy, may help us address climate change. And we often call that what's called the water energy nexus, right? That certainly in Santa Barbara, I don't know if you know this, we have a desal plant in Santa Barbara. It supplies about 30% of our water. And of course, people point out that running a desal plant is an extremely energy intensive activity, and it uses dirty energy, at least natural gas. And that of course exacerbates climate change. So these are these thorny issues where as we move water or as we use more water, for example, through desal to address climate change, we could also be exacerbating climate change. Yes, in the back.
I have a two-part question. Something I didn't hear about is the wealth. The wealthy aspects of society using so much more water than the rest of society. Like, for example, golf courses for hundreds of acres with the water constantly, and only for a small section of the society. And generally speaking, those types of venues or places don't have to conserve at all because generally they get the water for free from sweetheart the city. So has there been any research or impact on what they're doing and how we should escalate prices even more so in that segment? And secondly, what is the focus on capturing water, right? The last rains in California dumped like 1.8 trillion gallons of water, and we did virtually 0% effort to keep that from flowing into the water. Should we be focusing more on that as well as maybe using gray water in conjunction with, so that we don't have to have these drastic changes in our daily behavior?
Yeah, those are very smart questions. So on the first thing, of course, there are equity issues in how we think about resource allocation, and I think you raise an interesting one. I think, at least for my work on electricity, these are political deals that get made, right? Where certain actors have privileges to use things like electricity at a lower rate. So for example, we let industrial and commercial users of electricity pay less for that electricity in the water space. The big thing is, of course, agriculture. We let certain actors spend less. And often the justification for that is that they provide economic benefit, right? That the water has an economic value. And perhaps that's the same thing that's made, for example, for a golf course. And I agree with you that those things have to be challenged and contested. That's a difficult thing to do. It's a political act, and it's going to involve, especially in a decentralized water management system, you can't just hit it once, probably at the top down. I mean, you could try, go to Sacramento and pass a law perhaps to change those kinds of things. But with a decentralized governance system, it's really hard to do that. In terms of collection, we actually do have a fairly extensive network in this state, and others may know more about this than me, of reservoirs that do collect a fair amount of water. That isn't to say that we shouldn't be having more permeability in our built environment so that more water goes into the ground. I think a big challenge with water storage in this state, at least this is what I know and others may correct me, is that given the way the rainfall pattern works, we have to be saving water for the summer. And so the amount of storage is a similar issue actually in electricity when we think about intermittent resources, that's wind and solar, and battery storage, right? We have to be building a huge amount of storage to carry the water from the rainy season in the winter to the dry season in the summer. And so there are some really big challenges in terms of how rain is distributed across the year and how that affects the storage in California. So I don't think it's a simple problem, and others who are water experts could agree or disagree with me on that, but it's a big storage challenge. Yes?
For instance, we're a 100% groundwater agency, and even if it's a really rainy year like this year, our groundwater resources are not directly reactive to that. And so we want them to know, even though the drought's over, maybe above the ground, below the ground, we still have some challenges we'd like them to make sure they know about and keep it and have their behavior match that supply. So I was wondering, efficiency and supply and how those interrelate with your resources.
Yeah, so I am aware of the recent laws in Sacramento to sort of drive more efficiency on the water conservation side. I think what I would just say is that, the best way to save water is probably based on evidence, right? That we have done some kind of evaluation of what works and that we somehow roll that out across different urban water districts. And what disturbs me, having studied this for a while, is that there is very little effort to actually study what works. So what is the best way to get people to save water? And I'm not seeing that coming out of the state in terms of let's package this budget or this efficiency mandate with evaluation, where we actually learn how we can get people to save water more effectively. That's something that I'm trying to do with some small grants here, but that's not enough. I'm just one person, and it would be great to let 1,000 flowers bloom across the state in terms of, for example, giving urban water districts a budget to do evaluations of how they're saving water. And I think that could help us learn a lot about how we can get this to work even more effectively. In terms of groundwater management, it is not my area of expertise. I have two colleagues at Bren who are real experts on that, Scott Jascheko and Deborah Javelin. They do a lot of work on estimating groundwater resources. I think groundwater has some really particular challenges from a visibility and salience perspective when it comes to the public, because you can't see it, right? So in Santa Barbara County, as I mentioned with Lake Cachuma, we have these really cool real-time meters where we can go look at the lake and we can look at the data, and they give daily reports. Every time it rains, we see how much Cachuma went up. The public can fairly easily see how the lake is doing. Journalists can see how the lake is doing. They can write stories about it. I think with groundwater management, at least my understanding of it, it's harder to do that kind of a thing. It's harder to see that resource. It's harder to estimate what the level of the resource is, and therefore I think it's harder to communicate. So I think that is a particularly big challenge that you probably have dealing with groundwater resources that above water resources just don't have in the same way. But I commend you for your work, and go save some water. That's excellent. Yes, Kevin.
So I'm completely convinced that norms play a big role in that, because as a homeowner, when I think about when I'm motivated to fix my irrigation system because I feel a moral imperative, and especially if the leak is in my front, more so than the back. So I'm completely convinced by that. But I'm trying to think about what is it that changes norms, and what do we learn? So I know you have the fixed effects model, but the fact is that some agencies changed to hanging those door hangers during your time period, and something caused them to do that.
Yes.
And there's something
Yes.
exogenous.
Totally
So
valid.
Just as a quick comment it'd be kind of cool just to call them up and ask them why they started doing it. What made you do it? Was it just somebody in the office just one day and it was plausibly exogenous, or is it there was a town meeting and this kind of groundswell that happened during that time period, and it led them to do it. So those would be two different stories. But then I was thinking, more generally about what makes norms change and stick. And so I was thinking about recycling, and so when I was a kid, the reason parents started recycling was because all the kids at school were taught, you should recycle. All the kids came home and they told their parents, you should be recycling. And that's, it wasn't, the law so much. But I'm just trying to think about, sort of what are the levers that are, just maybe based on other use cases or something, of what are the levers that we have to change norms?
Yeah, so on the first point about endogeneity, I take your point, of course. I think that, or we could also think of it as like a compound treatment, right? That there's something going on in that city or place, and that is both manifested in the treatment of door hangers or social penalties of some variety, as well as perhaps other things too. I would say that, though, the exact timing of that might be a little more random, right? One thing we've been trying to get at is there's these regional water groups, and if they, for example, have best practice sharing and are somehow diffusing it, because that would be a bit more exogenous, where they would like say, hey, maybe you should try door hangers, like, because all these cities are kind of coming up with the same idea, so they're probably like in a diffusion sense talking to one another. We have tried to talk to urban water district managers. Anybody who's studied them will tell you that I think, again, it's a resource management, like they just are very scarce resource time, but we've only managed to get one to talk to us. And I mostly study energy, as I've mentioned. I've talked to oil and gas lobbyists, like senators. One of my colleagues has talked to former presidents and prime ministers for our research, right? Like, you can talk to people if you want to, but somehow urban water district managers do not want to talk to us. And I don't know. I think there's also a culture of like autonomy where they aren't regulated in the same way that, for example, electricity providers are, and so they're special districts, right? There's this kind of autonomy thing going on there. So I don't know. Every time me and Patrick meet and we go in a circle over our findings for like the 20th time, I'm like, we gotta talk to people. He's like, yeah, we've tried that. So we're gonna try more. If you have ideas about how to do that, I am very open to it. I do a lot of interviewing in my work, but it's been hard. In terms of what are the levers that work, I mean, what we have here is these like door hangers or some kind of public thing. I think the next place we're going to go in this study is to look at changes in lawns for using satellite data. So yeah, because I don't know if we're familiar with this solar adoption study, but there's a study from Yale that shows that people kind of adopt solar in a cluster, that they like look at their neighbors and think about it. And so we're starting to think, like, is that also what's happening at the urban scale, where somebody let their lawn go brown, or they xeriscape it, or they change it? So can we get high resolution enough satellite data so that we can look at how clusters of landscaping change in a neighborhood? Because I think that there could be something like that going on. Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah, I'd love to get a link to that. That would be great. Thank you. Yes.
So, really enjoyed the talk, and the idea of getting data, obviously, I'm glad you pointed that out. It's tough, and congratulations for getting all that.
Oh, that's very nice of you. You should be my peer reviewer.
Yeah. Well, maybe not.
Oh, no.
But I wanted to talk to you about your average pricing.
Yes.
And also, so two issues there, I think, is kind of going back to what Kevin said, is that as this drought is going on from 2010, let's say, each of the water districts are engaging in meeting their urban water management plan, which was 20 by 2020, right? So they're already engaging in a lot of these activities. So in how your fixed effects at the district level, you just allowed price to vary at the district level, right? But you control everything else being fixed, correct? Okay, so in that sense, not everything else is being fixed, because throughout this whole drought, they're implementing their urban drought water management plan. So they're engaging in other activities in terms of restricting outdoor watering, use of hose, all these other messaging strategies. So that might give a little bit of noise with your price variable. And then the second thing is I can imagine that by using average price, you could have a situation like down here where they would drop the indoor price, like the tier 1 price, increase the outdoor price. Nothing happens to average, but you actually see an observation in terms of the use goes down. And that's what we found with a number of water districts when we use an analysis at the household level. So in this case, your model would say there's no response between price and conservation, because we see conservation going down, whereas that if you control for that kind of marginal pricing, and I know there's a debate about marginal versus average pricing, but you might get a different conclusion in terms of the effectiveness of price. Lastly, price is also used for raising revenues. So because of all the conservation that they were doing, they realized, oh shoot, we got to raise some revenue. So we just had, through these non-price measures, people reduce conservation or increase conservation. Now we're short on revenue, so we're going to increase price. So it's a lagged price effect. And so in that sense, you're going to say, look, it didn't affect conservation. Well, it's not being used for conservation in that respect, because people just conserve. It's being used for generating revenue. So anyway, I mean, interesting. It's tough to get at that with a district level average price, but I mean, you're making great progress on it. And at least down here for the water agencies, we're having a really good relationship with them.
That's great.
So maybe it's these mountains between us, but if you come down here, I think you'll find that water agencies are really welcoming of working with researchers.
That's great.
And yeah, so
Even write for them letters of support.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, I mean, I do think, though, so I take all your critiques on price. You know, we can see that at the beginning of the time period, we already have massive differences between the best performers and the worst performers. So perhaps if we extended the panel backwards in time, and at least on pricing, that is a viable thing to do. I don't think it's viable to do on the other variables because we'd have to get them to tell us they don't remember what they did, and it's an issue. But we could, for example, and we were talking that you have historical pricing data on an annual basis, we could, for example, extend it further back in time, and maybe we would see the relationship. But even from the way you described it, to me, it doesn't really seem like, from the story you're telling, that like people are saving water, so therefore the district has less money, so then they need to raise prices. It doesn't seem from that story that it's driving conservation. The prices are driving conservation. And that's all the model's telling us, right? That price increases don't seem to be driving conservation.
Average prices.
Yes, average prices. But even on your marginal price story, I don't know how common it is that people have a different indoor versus outdoor price. We certainly don't have it. We have...
Common down.
Oh, it's pretty calm down here. Okay, well, maybe in the desert this is more common because outdoor watering maybe doesn't make as much sense. Yeah. Well, maybe that's something I should look into. That's very helpful. Oh, and for the person leaving, if you could somehow send me that thing, that would be lovely.
I'll give you a copy.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, yes.
I'm an engineer, and I see two kinds of efficiencies, but we're talking about all efficiency as being the same. There's the efficiency as an engineer is the plant getting the water I want it to get, uniformity. And then there's the efficiency of changing society to think that, well, maybe what I want isn't a grass, maybe what I want is rocks and drought-tolerant plants, which is water savings, I guess. Do you see a way to account for those as separate goals and objectives and measurable ideas?
Yeah, so those are commonly used, conservation versus efficiency as ideas, right? So I'm talking about conservation here, not efficiency. Those are different ideas, I agree. And at least one of the things you're talking about comes up in the study in that rebates. So rebates are these programs that a lot of urban water districts run where if you, for example, change your landscaping, you can get some money back to do that. So there are programs that are theoretically driving that kind of a structural conservation as opposed to sort of a behavioral change, right? Like if I save water by having a bucket in my shower today and therefore turning off my irrigation and then dumping it on my tree, I got to do that every single time. It's a repeated behavior. Versus if I change my landscaping to xeriscaping or I have a neighbor in my neighborhood that literally just took gravel, painted it green, and put it on the ground. Interesting choice, right? Like if I do that, it's done, I don't have to water that gravel anymore. So I think that there are maybe different strategies that are better in the longer term. Yeah.
Savings are due to efficiency improvements, and a lot of the programs that we run are to encourage efficiency,
Yes.
not necessarily to transform the landscape. So you might be measuring efficiency improvements as part of your water savings.
Yeah, I think efficiency improvements are. Things like a low flow shower head is an efficiency improvement, right? Changing the way your toilets flush. Those are all efficiency improvements. And those are things that the water districts are promoting. Those are part of them. And they often fall under rebate programs, right? That's how they drive new technology adoption in these urban water districts. Great. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.